The topic is the spirituality of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. The guest is Dr. Baldwin. Dr. Baldwin, you know, we're getting ready very soon to celebrate Dr. King's holiday quite soon. And so I think that we've said a lot of things about it over the years, et cetera, but I don't think that we can say too much about how important it is. Let's talk about the upcoming celebration and what you think people ought to be prepared to do this year in terms of trying to honor Dr. Martin Luther King and make this day a reality and make the event itself a reality in all of our lives, not only African Americans, but all of our lives.
Yes, I think given the crises that we face now on a domestic and international level, we should really celebrate Dr. King by focusing on his legacy of spirituality. As you well know, we are in an economic downturn now. There are crises that we are facing internationally. And we need to understand that Dr. King taught us a lot about how to deal with these kinds of domestic and international crises. And one way of dealing with them, of course, is through the prism of spirituality. That is, we have to understand that prayer and meditation are very much a part of how we function in the world. And Dr. King was quite intentional in respecting spirituality across religious boundaries. That is, he respected Islam, he respected Buddhism, he respected Islam, he respected Hinduism, he respected all religions because he felt that they contributed something to our understanding of spirituality. So I think we got to get back to spiritual values as a way of dealing with the crises that confront us. And I think that that taking the King legacy seriously in terms of what it teaches us about spiritual values is very, very important.
As a matter of fact, I think I would certainly have to agree with that, because one of the most important things that I think we find today is that so many people really don't have any real understanding of what we mean when we talk about a spiritual life and spiritual values, spiritual principles, and et cetera. And so I think, in other words, so many folks don't believe that there is a spirit in man.
Exactly, exactly.
And so, and I think that if we can, and I think you've demonstrated that Dr. King certainly agreed that there's a spirit in man.
That's right. That's right.
And that Jesus Christ was his leader. There's no doubt about that in prayer and et cetera. But a lot of folks don't put that much confidence or that much faith in a spiritual life.
That's right, and that's unfortunately because Dr. King always reminded us that life is not about an obsession with the material things of life. We have to also turn to the spiritual. He often talked about relating to his divine companion, who is God. That we have to have a sense of a higher power, that we have to communicate with God through prayer and meditation, and that this in itself can be an empowering force as we face life.
Very good, and it really is. And I think Dr. King more than anyone. As a matter of fact, you mentioned how involved spirituality was in everything that he did, and I often think about the great speech that he made in Washington, D.C. I Have a Dream speech, and that was all spiritual.
Yeah, I mean, if you watch that, if you analyze that speech, it was all about spirituality. Dr. King was driven by a kind of spirituality that made it possible for him to confront the challenges and the realities of the movement and to stand tall. He was never at a point where he was faltering under the pressure of the movement, in part because of the role of prayer and more generally speaking, the role of spirituality in his life.
What did you say in reference to your prayer life, in reference to the speech that he made, that I've been to the mountaintop? How could you deal with anything without dealing with that?
Exactly,
I mean,
exactly. That was a speech peppered with spirituality, if I might make that kind of point. Dr. King was a spiritual leader, and we need to get beyond this idea of seeing him as as only a social activist or a civil rights leader, to begin to understand him as a spiritual leader and as a model of spirituality for our time.
And something that we could gain from him simply by studying him and understanding what he was all about.
Exactly, and we get at his spirituality first and foremost through his prayer life.
Well, Dr. Baldwin, you know, you've had a chance to deal with Dr. King over many, many years, and do you think that his reputation is becoming, what do you think about his reputation at this time in our life?
I think there's a tendency today to domesticate Dr. King. We often, the Glenn Beck demonstration last year in August, this year I should say, in August of 2010, was staged as an event designed to promote the civil rights movement. I think what we see today is a disturbing pattern in the sense that people are distorting that legacy. They're using that legacy to support particular kinds of agendas. And Dr. King was not about right-wing agendas. He was about the liberation of people from racism, from classism and economic exploitation, from war and human destruction, from religious bigotry and intolerance. Dr. King was about liberating and empowering people, not about disempowering and disenabling people. And I think we have to keep that in mind as we celebrate.
Would you predict a greater celebration this year because of and why would we celebrate? We've got a black president now, and what does that mean in terms
but
of?
I think Dr. King would say that we have not yet reached the promised land.
Okay.
That we have an African American in the White House, but we still have a long way to go in terms of achieving not only economic justice, but in overcoming racism and overcoming the problem of war. Dr. King, toward the end of his life, said that the two most important issues that we confront are economic justice and international peace. So we got to deal with the economic injustice in our society, the classism in our society, and we got to deal with the war and the human destruction.
And all of that would eventually bring Dr. King's legacy, make it a reality for a lot of people.
Yes, in terms of the realization of what he called the beloved
community. Very good. And of course, Dr. Baldwin, we've got about 2 minutes. You've got another book here, Never to Leave Us Alone, The Prayer Life. Well, what about The Voice of Conscience?
The Voice of Conscience is a book that looks at images of the church in Dr. King's thought, and it too is about Dr. King's spirituality. But I focus on biblical images of the church as temple of God, the church as covenant community, the church as body of Christ, and also some cultural historical images such as the church as conscience of the state, the church as moral guardian of society. So that book too is about Dr. King's spirituality. And I think in order to understand his spirituality, you must focus on both his prayer life, and also take into account how he viewed the church and how he launched his movement
out of the church in a real sense.
Because the church became a kind of focal point, a rallying point, a source of inspiration for the civil rights movement that he led.
And you know, it's hard to argue against the church if you're talking about equality, you see, and so that's it would be that would be the forum.
That's right.
That you would think about all men being created equal and et cetera. And so it makes a lot of sense to think in terms of him being a spiritual leader and at the same time dependent upon the church. And building around.
Because the church was the custodian of his spirituality. It was through the church that he developed spiritual maturity and this sense of his own spirituality. So we have to take both into account.
Say something, Dr. Baldwin, in 30 seconds about going to church.
I think that's important, and when you read Dr. King's speeches and his interviews and his letters, that is very, very important. I think a lot of us today don't consider that to be very important. It's not about simply going to church, but participating in the life of the church through tithing, through participating in other activities in the church, That was quite important for Dr. King, because first and foremost, he was not only a man of spirituality, but he was a man of the
God,
church as well.
Good. He was a man of God, too.
Yeah.
And, of course, let me thank you, Dr. Baldwin, for bringing that excellent information to us. And let me encourage our audience to tune in again next week for another informative edition of Comments. Thank you, and good morning.